Hey guys, Moose here. Welcome back to another episode of Stonehearth in our Rise Children playthrough, and we actually have a pretty interesting topic today. It's more or less negative, but it's interesting nonetheless. Today is February 21st of 2017. Of course, you know what year it is. And we will be, not directly, but kind of starting out. This will be our starting point. How about that? It'll be a little bit of a jumping off point. But 5 years ago today, in 2012, Asura's Wrath came out for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, and if you're not familiar with that game, the main reason that you might be is because the real ending of the game was locked behind DLC for $7. So obviously there's a lot of issues with that, and you know, the issues with DLC to this effect have been discussed frequently by many people who, many of which are not as smart as me, but many of which are smarter than me. Point is, it's been discussed to death, so I'll talk about it briefly, but that's not really the main thing I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what could have been in effect of DLC like that, which I don't think is possible, but it's an interesting look back into the history of gaming that I think is appropriate to look into with this topic. So, first I'm going to tell these guys to retreat because they're being stupid again. One guy's actually almost dead, but yeah. So, just to briefly touch on the DLC topic, I think pretty much we can all agree that that's like a really shitty money-grubbing tactic, and if I'm going to buy a game at full price, I expect to get the game. I don't expect to get the game with pieces cut out so they can be sold to me later for more money. I think that's a reasonable expectation, and it's, you know, there's not really much more to say about it than that. It's unreasonable to expect your customers to pay a whole bunch of money for a game only to find that it's not finished, and then pay you more money for the finished version later on. I think Asura's Wrath, I don't even know who made it, but I hope they're not doing much business anymore, or at the very least lost a lot of business as a result of that. And you see a lot of situations like this with other games, where perhaps less egregious examples of maybe similar behavior occur with other titles where, you know, Assassin's Creed games came out kind of unfinished and, you know, they got yelled at. I mean, there was a significant backlash. Enough that they needed to stop making annual installments of Assassin's Creed games. And that's significant. That's a major business strategy change that was resulting from negative backlash resulting from their decisions. So it's worth mentioning. It's a significant thing to say, hey, you know, we're not going to do this anymore because it's costing us for whatever reason. And it may not look like it's costing them, but they wouldn't make that decision if it wasn't costing them something. So, there's a lot of examples of this. We all understand why it's a bad thing. Obviously, it's anti-consumer to do things like that. And most of the time people pay for it when they do it. Not always, but most of the time. Lately it's been better. People still pre-order, and pre-orders are part of the problem, but that's probably not going to go away, unfortunately. I pre-ordered stuff recently. It was, you know, Dragon Quest Builders, which had already come out effectively in Japan, so I knew what I was getting, but still, you know, I understand. If you feel like, hey, you're a stupid hypocrite, you shouldn't have pre-ordered DQB, fine. I don't have a problem with you saying that or feeling that way, because there's an element of truth to it. I can rationalize it and say that, hey, I knew what I was getting, so it's fine, but the reality is much simpler than that. The reality is just I wasn't really thinking about it, and I was just like, well, I'm going to play this game, so I'm going to buy it. And I just picked it up. That's it. Like, I ordered it off Amazon, that's the end of the conversation. I wasn't really putting that much thought into it, so mistake on my part, sure. You need to be a smart consumer, otherwise you're creating these situations and allowing the Asura's Wraths of the world to prosper sometimes. It's not necessarily that black and white. Early access is another thing. We've talked about this before, and we will talk about it again because it's an interesting topic. I don't necessarily think there's a solution. Not an easy one anyway, but we will look at actually a historical solution to this issue that came about in the 80s that you can still kind of, like, we're kind of towing the line. We're sort of reversing that decision a bit, I think. But it's complicated. We're not totally reversing it. But the industry has been moving away from it, and you'll understand what I mean in a minute. Or in a few minutes as I explain what I'm getting at here. So, the interesting thing that I want to talk about that has to do with Asura's Wrath is what is commonly referred to as the North American video game crash of 1983, during which the annual... Is it revenue? Yeah, revenue. Revenue from the video game industry in 1983 was about 3.2 billion, and it dropped to about 100 million. So 97% drop. I'm just taking that off Wikipedia. Very simple. In 1985. So in a period of 2 years, it dropped by 97%. So people completely lost interest or confidence in video games. I'm not going to get too into detail on why or how that happened. I have a very broad, simple understanding, and I'm going to just leave it at that, because I'm more interested in relating it to current events and looking at the current situation in the gaming industry and saying, okay, well, here's what I see is going on. Personal opinion, I'm not really an expert. I am just a consumer in this environment, so the best I can do is talk about what I see and how I feel about it. So, my perspective on why the video game crash of 1983 occurred was because we had... Ooh, this is nice, it's actually getting built. We had a lot of games coming up. You know, a lot of those games that you see, like the E.T. game, where it was a bunch of them got dumped in a landfill. I think they dug them up recently or something. Not that long ago. You probably heard of that. That was one of those games. There's a bunch of terrible games that got released, and, you know, I mean, think about it these days. You ever have a grandmother or, like, a parent try and buy you a video game? Or a significant other that's not into gaming? And they, you know, their heart's in the right place, they want to get you the right thing, but they pick up the wrong game, or they pick up some, like, Barbie game, or some shovelware trash that's being marketed basically to people who don't know any better, and that's how they make their money. That's kind of what was going on. Because you have to understand, gaming was nowhere near as popular then as it is now. The literacy in that market was much lower. So now these days is like, yeah, you know the big players, right? A lot more people are aware of them. Back then, not so much. You don't really know what these companies are, who they are, is this game any good? It's hard to discern what's actually quality. And you also have to understand this within the context of, can't do 20, I can do 15. I can't even really do 15, but I have to assume we'll harvest them by then. You have to understand that this happened within the context of a world that didn't have the internet, didn't have the level of communication that we have now at all, and you couldn't just say, hey, I don't know anything about this game, let's go watch a Let's Play, or let's look at reviews on Metacritic. You can't, there was no good way to do research on these things, and there wasn't like I would assume there probably wasn't a dedicated store. There wasn't like I don't want to give GameStop any credit because I actually hate GameStop, but you couldn't just go to a store and see like, oh, I wonder how this game is. Maybe you have a demo. I can just check it out. You couldn't do that. So you're just really, you've got a box and either it's good or bad and you don't really know until you buy it. And that's a problem because you don't know, and there's no good way to figure it out. So what happens when you combine that lack of information with an overwhelming amount of shovelware? Because this industry started booming and people are like, wow, there's money to be made here. 3.2 billion is a lot of money. That's what the industry was worth in 1983. So they're trying to get in on that. And they get in on it, and it crashes because they just started making shovelware. Think about it like the App Store. If you didn't have ratings, you didn't have any information from other people, all you could do is say, well, this looks good, so I'll buy it. And then you find out it's trash, and the next one you buy is trash, and the next one you buy is trash, and just on and on. And you have no way of knowing what you're getting until you buy it. And especially, now think of that as, you're not really buying it for yourself, you're buying it for your kid or something. And it's just like, if there's more than half of it is just shit and trash, you're gonna, more than half of the time, you're gonna be coming back with a game that's just terrible. So, what happens to mitigate that and improve the situation so that, you know, gaming obviously came back. I'm doing a Let's Play on YouTube right now. People are watching this. Gaming clearly didn't die then, so what happened to make it work? Again, this is my understanding. There's probably other interpretations of what went down and why, but my perspective is that you got situations like if you're around my age and you had one of the older consoles, like for me it was the old Game Boy games, and I think N64 games had this as well. You may recall seeing, in those cases, a Nintendo seal of approval saying, hey, Nintendo approved, this is an official game, it's legit. I actually looked at that when I was a kid and I didn't really get it. I was like, why do this? Like, it doesn't, I don't understand what the meaning of this is. But when you look at it within the context of what had happened in 1983 and you say, oh, okay, so they're doing quality control. And that's really what it boils down to, is Nintendo did quality control. And I think that is what ended it. That's what brought us back, because then you have basically not DRM, but content management, basically. By saying, hey, look, we're gonna, I think they, actually, yeah, you know what, it probably is DRM. I think it's not DRM in the sense that we have it today, but it's kind of like DRM. It wasn't there to prevent piracy. It was there to prevent unapproved products or software from running on consoles. So I think the NES and the SNES, well, maybe not the NES. NES was before the crash, I think. But I think the SNES had, in the cartridge, there was like a special chip that only Nintendo had access to. And basically what they, ooh, there's loot here. What they'd do is they'd say, hey, you submit your game, or whatever, we'll review it, and if it's good enough, then we give you, you know, we'll allow you to produce it. And we'll manufacture, I don't know if they handled, I would assume they probably wanted to handle the manufacture of the cartridges themselves and take a cut via that, rather than farming it out. Not that they own the factory, but that they were the ones doing business with the factory owner, rather than the developer. Which is probably better for the developer too, to be honest. But by doing that, they controlled what software would be on their console, and that allowed a situation where they could completely control their ecosystem and say, hey, you know, we're not going to have shovelware. So by doing that, they could restore confidence in it and say, look, if you go to a store and buy a game, you're going to get something decent. And that's meaningful. And that was, if I'm correct about why the crash occurred, and I think it's a reasonable opinion, I think it's supported by a lot of people who know more about it than I do. Basically, that's why I have the opinion, because I read about it, but that's a fix. You're certifying something. You're saying, look, this is good enough. And that has a lot of interesting parallels to some things that are going on today with Steam Greenlight and being phased out and going to Steam Direct, where you have to pay to get your game on Steam. Where you gotta, like, are they doing quality control? I don't know that they're doing quality control with that, but it's kind of a quality control thing. And it kind of makes you wonder. I don't think we have this issue as much today because of the internet, and we have that connectivity and access to information that prevents this from being such a problem, which is a very big deal. It's important that you have that access. And it changes things, but you still have these issues sometimes. And we're all aware of it. Like, look at No Man's Sky. I don't want to go back to No Man's Sky, but it's interesting to look at that and kind of figure out, okay, well, what's the fix? Like, how do you fix this? And it's difficult to say, because I have to say, okay, well, the first question is No Man's Sky on its own, forget all the hype, take all expectations away, take all the hype away, is No Man's Sky as a base product at $60 on release worth $60? or close enough to being worth $60 that it's acceptable within the context of the console market in general? I think the answer is maybe yes, actually. As crazy as that sounds, I don't think it's worth $60. But I think within the context of the other games that come out on console, it may actually be worth $60. Even though I don't like that, I don't like saying that, it physically pains me to say that, I think it makes some amount of sense. As weird as that may be. Did we have that, the knight go down? I don't think he went down. Okay, he was low on health, so I want to check. And he's okay, though. We're good. Yeah, he's being healed up still. That's good. Let's see about making some more doors. Give me a second to catch my breath a bit. Now we're making more anyway. I'm sure that goblin will get his ass kicked. Or he'll just go poof up here. Yeah, he's gonna go poof. That's fine. Leave him to his business. I'm gonna make like 10 more just to have them. So, yeah, I don't know. That's something I'd want to discuss with some other people who bought and played No Man's Sky, because I'm not really sure what the answer is. Like, that'd be something I'd really want to discuss on the Roundtable podcast that NL Bear Taffy, Rockley Smile / Nick, and Mathis Games have. I'd love to hear what they think about that. Particularly, I don't think NL ever played No Man's Sky. I'd like to talk to Bear Taffy about it, let's put it that way. Because I think Bear Taffy would have an interesting and somewhat reasoned opinion about it. But I also think Bear Taffy is more of like a happy-go-lucky guy who's just kind of having fun with life, whereas maybe Nick or NL would have a little bit more cynical and grounded, real-world, non-emotional response to what they think about that. But I think, looking at my experience and what I see, I kind of think the $60 price point is not justified, but is also, while not justified, it is in line with what I see from other $60 titles. And that's probably sounds crazy, but I'm actually at the point where I feel like if I'm paying $10 or $20 for a game, it's likely to be of higher quality than a $60 title. And that's like insane to me, but it's also true. A lot of $60 games that I buy these days don't really work, and that's kind of weird. I don't get it. Whereas like the $10, $20 ones have issues, but they're like, I derive a lot more enjoyment out of them. Not only more cost effective for the price point, but even just one-to-one, they're more fun for me. I don't know why that is, but yeah, what are you gonna do? The only one I wouldn't say that about, probably Titanfall 2, was I really regained some respect. Well, no, you know what? I never really lost any respect for those guys. Titanfall 1 was great. I didn't really like some of the DLC stuff, but they moved away from that. And then look, they learned their lesson in Titanfall 2. It's not paid. Like, it's just free. So I really don't have anything negative to say about them. That release was excellent. I do not regret paying $60 for that game. I didn't play it enough to justify the $60, but that's not because the game is bad. That's because I just moved on. I don't regret the expenditure, basically. Which is not something I can say about most $60 games. So, how does all of that, with Nintendo licensing games, basically, and really curating their system, how does that translate to the real world for modern gaming? I'm not sure it can, and I don't know that it needs to either. It's kind of a situation where you could say, okay, well, what could we do? Just could, not should or anything like that. What could we do? Well, Steam could curate games more closely and say, look, if you're not at a certain threshold, then we're not going to allow you to release your game on here. You're not good enough. I think you'd see a lot of backlash to that, because things are not bad enough yet that that's really something that needs to happen. To be completely honest. There are issues for sure, but it doesn't really need to happen right now, so it won't. it definitely will not happen. Because it doesn't... Valve would need, like, a real good reason to do that. Because it'll cost them money, and it won't really save them any money, as things stand. So the most that they're going to do is do systemic changes that are just a change instead of an addition. Curation would be an addition. That would cost them additional money, and they'd have to put more effort into it. Going from greenlight to direct doesn't really cost them money. May even make them more money because they're charging. But I think it's not really about making money for them. It's more about barrier to entry, and they're hoping maybe by doing it that way they can control it better, but I don't think that's really going to work out. So, basically, realistically, it will not happen, and it probably doesn't need to happen, because we have things like Metacritic, and we have things like Let's Plays, and there is a legitimate public outcry. Like, culture and how we interact and how we gather and consume information has changed so much since the 80s that it's not really necessary. Does that mean that games like Asura's Wrath are not a problem anymore? No, they're definitely a problem. But our solution is more public shaming than it is active curation and certification by an outside group. Now, that raises an interesting topic. Interestingly enough, I used to I volunteered like often, to the point where it was like not even a part-time job, but like a side thing where I helped out a bunch with a seafood sustainability group while I was going to college in Toronto. What they might do sometimes, and what they still do, I think, is they'd certify certain foods and say, hey, this is sustainable. I know we're going over time here, but this is this is a really interesting topic, I think. They'd say, hey, this is sustainable, you can trust it, we certified it. We're a neutral third party, we said this is good. Now, I don't think this would work because it's been eroded by false groups enough that I don't think it would really work out too well, but what if you had a version of that for gaming, where you say, hey, we certified that this game meets some basic standard of decency, where we're saying, hey, look, it's stable, it's good enough to be... Ooh, there's stuff over here. Where did this come from? It's meeting a basic level, it's meeting a basic standard, basically. And I don't know what that standard is or how you would define it, because the problem is you're getting into a fair bit of ambiguity by doing this, but would that be viable? I don't think it really would be, but it's an interesting thing to discuss and think about, because we're moving in that direction a bit, where you basically have industries popping up where it's kind of like third-party verification for different things, such as sustainability or organic stuff, where, okay, well, if it's just the company that made it saying it, how do you trust them, right? You can't, because it's just of course they're going to say it's the best possible. It's in if they have financial interest in doing that. But if someone else says it, now you can say, hey, well, okay, that's got to be legit, right? Not necessarily, but it's an interesting industry. And some of that, and the reason why I say, okay, well, it definitely would have some issues, is because there are groups like that that lie. And they say, hey, this is organic, especially in the health food and organic arenas. There's groups and organizations that'll say, hey, this is whatever. Like Dolphin Safe was one that historically would come up, and they'd say this is safe for dolphins, and the fishing methods used are safe for dolphins, and it wouldn't necessarily be true, because these things are not regulated like that, and you can kind of just say whatever as long as you don't touch on protected terms. And, there's obviously legal BS you have to pull, but the thing is, you can pull that BS. Like, it's actually a thing that you can do. So how do you build that trust? And then you start to get some issues. Like, I'd say if the humble people did this, and they developed like a certification basically to say, hey, like, this game is certified by us to be quality, and they could do that. Maybe they get an advance copy, and it would just say, here, okay, if we say that this game is certified, here's a very basic outline of the things that it has to be, the targets it has to hit. That'd be meaningful, but I don't think it can happen because you have things where it's just not as black and white. You can't just point to one thing and say this is what needs to happen, because some games will say, well, it doesn't run at 60 FPS all the time, so it's a bad game. Other games, that doesn't matter so much and it's not an issue. So it's really hard to set a standard for what is critical and what's not. No, it's town alert mode. That was a mistake. But we need to get the poor bastard who's hurt. Oh, he's gonna die. Alright, let's try to get him and then we'll end the episode. But it's tough. You really have to figure out, how am I going to do this properly? And I don't know that there's a good way. And in fact, I don't know that there's a way that's worth pursuing, because frankly, it's just not necessary. You don't need to do this. You can just do it by having Let's Plays and having public outcry and having Metacritic. These things resolve the issue for the most part. So is it worth going through all this effort to establish a certification process saying this is good, this is not good, you can play this safely, you can not play this safely? I feel like it's extra information that, while useful for some people, would not be considered for many others, and also would not be black and white enough to make a meaningful difference. So, interesting subject, interesting idea, probably not viable. So, with that is going to do it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed this one a lot, and I'm probably going to touch on this topic again later. It's a really interesting subject, particularly when you take into account some of the things that have happened in gaming history, such as the video game crash of 1983. And I hope this inspires you maybe to look into it and read up on it on Wikipedia, because it's a really interesting aspect of gaming history that I think a lot of people don't know about. So, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it like I said. Hope you'll join us for the next one as well. Take care.